And if you recall from my vlog of Cincy shirts, I said I bought a shirt that was a surprise for a future vlog. Well, here it is. Molly Wellman, drink maker and storyteller. And that's a clue to who'll be in today's video. Hey everyone, it's Cashew. Today's adventure brings us to Cincinnati, Ohio, and more specifically Eden Park. And I'm here with a friend, Molly Wellman. And I'll tell you more about Molly, and I'm going to tell you about why this gazebo that we're standing in is so significant. So stick around. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Our adventure starts here. Okay, so before we begin, Molly, why don't you tell everybody about yourself and what you do here in Cincinnati?
So, I am a bar owner here in Cincinnati. I own a bar called Japs that I've had for the last 10 so years. We make cocktails from the 1700s to the 1950s. And I mean, I have this weird job. I study them. Hard job, but I've got this. But I also study spirits as well, and the history of the spirits. And it leads me down a lot of rabbit holes, let me tell you. So we do a lot of that at Japs. So when you come to Japs, I make you a classic cocktail, but I also tell you a story that goes with it. So a little history behind it. And
how did you get interested in Prohibition?
It goes along with the territory. You know, when you're making cocktails that are before Prohibition, you know, Prohibition was kind of a big deal. It kind of stopped all of that. So it kind of goes with the territory.
I found it interesting is when I started studying about Prohibition that Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky had such a huge role in it. You think of Chicago and New York, but...
Right. So Cincinnati really did have a huge part in Prohibition, mainly because of a guy named George Remus. Have you heard of him?
Yes, and we'll go into that in just a second.
Awesome.
Okay, Molly, so I have you here today at the gazebo, and you and I had talked, well, 2018 at 1940s Day, and you gave a really great presentation on George Remus. And so I was wondering if you could tell everybody about George Remus and what this gazebo has to do with it.
Well, that comes at the good part. So it is a fascinating story about George Remus. You know, and to know that it was like something that really happened here in Cincinnati. You know, so there was this guy. His name was George Remus. And he actually started out in Chicago. You know, his family was from Germany. He came with his family from Germany. They stopped off in New York and then Baltimore and then a little bit in Minnesota, and then eventually made their way to Chicago so that George Remus's father could find work. George Remus's father did not find work, though. He was not a very, well, let's see, he liked the bottle. He was in his cups quite a bit. So at the age of 14, George took it upon himself, being the eldest child, to quit school and went to work to support the family. He ended up working in his uncle George's pharmacy up in Chicago and did really well, eventually putting himself through pharmaceutical school. He actually lied about his age because you had to be 21 and he was only 18 to get his license. But he did really well with it. In fact, buying out his uncle at the shop and then actually opening another one as well. He did really well with it. Well, the way that George was this very ambitious man. He was very, he's very all about himself. You know, he always was. And he was also into athletics too. I mean, that's something you should know. He was really into swimming. You know, he would go and put himself through a bunch of swimming competitions and stuff in the river, and did really well. He was so competitive. But eventually he got tired of the whole pharmaceutical and he wanted to do better for himself. So in his early 20s, he decided he would go into law. He wasn't really into being a doctor, although he did put himself through optometry school at one point so he could, like, you know, help people with their eye problems and stuff. And so he could call himself a doctor. That's really why he But he didn't like the way that doctors were at that time. So he put himself through law school, and he did it quicker than anybody else. He did it in about 18 months' time. So, and usually this would have been like a 3-year program. So he passed the bar and he set up his own law firm, and eventually, was working the law. He did really well. This time it was around the 1920s, and the Volstead Act had gone into effect, which pretty much stated that it was against the law for anyone to distribute, to make, to buy or sell liquor, really, in a nutshell. There were two things that you could legally have liquor for. One of them was for medicinal purposes. So if your big toe got hurt, you could like go to your doctor and say, "Oh my gosh, my big toe hurts, doctor, can you write me a prescription?" And he would write you a prescription for whiskey, and that would cure everything. I think it still does. The other thing is, and this is a little known fact, you could also, if you were a baker, you could also get a license to get rum or brandy so that you could bake with it as well. So
like rum balls and stuff?
What's that?
Like rum balls?
Rum balls and rum cake, fruit cake, things like that. So you could eat your liquor legally, or you could use it as a medicinal. I think the whole family would break their toe or hurt their toe so they could all get a prescription of whiskey. But George decided that he could do a lot better if he got into the bootlegging business rather than with just law. He was, like I said, he was very much about himself. He was a snappy dresser. He was a snappy dresser, but it was really weird because he didn't wear underwear, which was really weird at the time. He was a snappy dresser. He liked nice things, and he really wanted to make a boom. Now, let me go back a little bit. George actually, he had been married. He got married when he was younger. He married a woman named Lillian. She was a nice piano teacher, in Chicago. And they had a daughter. Her name was Romola, or some people say it differently, but I say Romola. And eventually, he worked a lot, right? And eventually he met another woman. And this woman's name was Imogene Holmes. Imogene Holmes she was really into herself as well. Let's just put it that way. Imogene, all she wanted to do was be famous. She wanted to be rich and famous. And she went to all lengths to get there. She would make up stories in the newspapers just to get her name in the newspaper so she could be called famous, Well, eventually George and Imogene met, and they were like two peas in a pod. George eventually divorced Lillian, and at that point they decided they were going to move to Cincinnati. Now, why Cincinnati and not Chicago? Well, one, Chicago had enough bootleggers in it already. But two, George was really smart. He knew from being a pharmacist that there was a loophole in the Volstead Act, that loophole that said that you could legally get whiskey for medicinal purposes. So he used it to his advantage. Knowing the whole trade of pharmacy, he decided to do some research. He found that in Cincinnati, it was kind of like the epicenter for where about probably 85% of all the bourbon and whiskey in the whole United States was made and stored in a 300-mile radius around Cincinnati. So he thought that was the spot. Also, it was pretty much an untouched market for bootleggers. I mean, there were some, but he had bigger ideas. He knew he could do better. So he and Imogene moved down to Cincinnati with Imogene's daughter, Ruth, his stepdaughter. And they set up shop. They moved into the Sinton Hotel, which is this like opulent hotel. And I wish it was still here because when you read about the Sinton, it was just absolutely beautiful in downtown Cincinnati. George ended up setting up a bunch of drug companies with his, pharmaceutical experience. He knew how to do that. He also started buying up distilleries. He started asking around and buying up all these distilleries. I think what's recorded, he owned about 9 distilleries, and then he had his hand in a bunch of other ones as well. But he bought up as many as he could, and we had quite a few distilleries, especially in Kentucky and in Indiana. The Squibb, he had that one. The Flashman, the Clifton, the old 76 distillery in Newport. He had quite a few. So he had his hands on all that storage of medicinal whiskey, right? With that, though, he also set up a trucking company so that he could transport that whiskey from his distilleries to his drug companies. But he went one step further. There was one night where he actually was in the truck and he was kind of hijacked, right? And it was right on the bridge. It was on the suspension bridge. And it was a big to-do. He actually got hit in the head and he had a scar to show it. And from that day on, he decided he was going to make sure that every one of his trucks had an armed car with it, right? A car with armed people in it. So he actually set up a group to hijack his own trucks so that he could bootleg that whiskey. He set up a couple depots. One of the biggest and well-known depots that he had was on the west side of Cincinnati in what was nicknamed Death Valley, which was kind of off of Queen City. And it was an old farm, and they set up a big bootlegging ring from that farm. That was the biggest. But he had a couple around the city and in Hamilton and whatnot too. It was a big operation. They called it the Circle, and he did really well. In a span of just a year, he made about, I think it was about $2 million at that time, so he was quite wealthy. Imogene and George Remus eventually moved out of the Sit-In Hotel, and they bought a big mansion over on the west side of Cincinnati in Price Hill on Hermosa Avenue. And it was the old Lackman Brewers mansion, actually. And they redid the entire thing with the best furniture, the most glorious artwork, the most expensive books, the most incredible rugs.
Didn't it have a Rookwood swimming pool?
It did. Since George was such a big swimmer, he built a swimming pool that cost over $100,000, and it was all tiled in Rookwood tile. Absolutely gorgeous. So Imogene loved it. They would throw these lavish parties that would rival any party that anybody has ever seen in Cincinnati. None that I have ever read about in Cincinnati. He would hire bands, the best food. He would have girls walking around in these big costumes, serving drinks and serving hors d'oeuvres and whatnot. And when his guests would leave, usually they would leave with a gift. And the gift would be a diamond stick pin or a diamond bracelet. Or sometimes he would put, $100 or $1,000 bills, I guess they had those at the time, underneath their plates at dinner. There was even a party where he gave away a car to each female guest that came to the party. So I would have definitely wanted to be friends with them. Definitely.
And then wasn't the house has been torn down, but like part of the gates in one of the high schools?
Right. So since then, the house has been torn down, but parts were sold off, and I'll get to that. But the gates that led to the entrance of their mansion actually are the gates to the back way into Elder High School. So you can go and see a little piece of Remus over there.
That'd be cool.
Well, Remus was doing really well. He also, another thing, to make sure that he had some security in not getting caught, he went to Washington and he hobnobbed with the Harding administration. He found a friend in a guy named Jess Smith, who was, he was kind of like the secretary to the, I don't know, I can't remember, the right hand, one of the right hand men of Harding. He went there so he could secure liquor permits so that he could legally transfer this medicinal whiskey from wherever he wanted. He would grease a lot of hands, and he greased Jess Smith's hands so much that to make sure that he would stay out of federal prison if he ever got caught. Well, it did come the day where something went wrong. Someone didn't make a phone call. And out of the Death Valley Depot, some of the agents there found that there was a lot of liquor that they were stopping in cars that were wrapped up in Cincinnati newspaper. And they tracked it back to the Death Valley Depot. And he eventually got caught. Now, it was, this was an operation that was very well secure at Death Valley. It was very hard to get to. That's why it was called Death Valley. And it was heavily, guarded. Well, somehow they got in. Somebody was supposed to make a phone call to, dump something or get rid of something, and they didn't, and they got caught. And it got back to Remus, even with all of his, trying to, keep his name out of a lot of things. He used a lot of aliases. Anyway, so it got back to Remus. He was arrested and tried for bootlegging, and he was convicted. He went to go and say, "Hey, Jess, up in Washington, you said you would keep me out of jail." Jess kept saying, "You're going to be out of jail. You're going to be fine. You're not going to federal jail." Well, George went back to Cincinnati after greasing his hand again to make sure that he wasn't going to go to jail. And it was just a few days later that somebody, he looked at the newspaper and he saw that Jess Smith had committed suicide. So his security there went out the window, and he was sent to federal prison. And he went to Atlanta. It was in Atlanta. He spent a good 2 years there. Now, during his time there, he gave all of his power of attorney to the one person he trusted the most. That was Imogene. So at the same time, while he was in jail, which wasn't really like jail, he greased so many hands, he was allowed to do whatever he wanted in jail, really. And he had a very comfortable accommodations. It wasn't like, he had a cot, he had a real bed, and somebody came and cleaned his cell, and he was allowed all his books, and he got fancy dinners, and he was allowed to go on dates with Imogene. He was, for jail, it was pretty lavish. Well, the prosecutor decided she needed to send somebody down to make sure, find out what the heck was going on, because she didn't like what she was hearing. And she sent an agent, his name was Franklin Dodge. Franklin Dodge came down, and he interviewed George Remus. And he found out what George Remus had been getting into. And he decided to kind of find out what was going on with Imogene. And he hooked up with Imogene. And Imogene fell fast and just hard for Franklin Dodge. So she had power of attorney of all of George Remus's assets. She and Franklin Dodge ended up selling off almost all of his assets, all the distilleries, all the, drug companies. They stripped the entire mansion of every stick of furniture that was in the house, all the art, everything. They would drive around in his cars. He had many cars, and he drove around in his cars. When George finally got out of jail, he was handed divorce papers by Imogene's lawyers. He went back to the mansion, found it completely dark. Finally got in, the locks had been changed. He got in through a window and found nothing but a cot and a pair of old shoes that didn't even fit him. He was pissed. He went out, he found that all of his belongings, his fine clothes, his silk shirts and everything had been thrown out the back door. He was livid, and this man had a temper. He had a big temper. So they went through some divorce hearings. He was very mad. He almost threw one of her lawyers out the window. I mean, that was another story. But the day of the divorce came about. It was October 6th, I believe it was 1921. And Imogene and her daughter Ruth had been staying just right up in Walnut Hills here at the Alms Hotel, which is still standing. You can go up there. It's on Victory Parkway. And George knew this. He wanted to go there before the divorce hearing just to talk to her, just to have a few words. I'm sure it was going to be a very nice conversation. So he pulled up to the Alms and waited for her to come out. So she came out, and she jumped right in the cab with her daughter. They started to drive down Victory Parkway and started driving into the park, and George's car followed her. And they sped up, and he sped up, and they chased her on a beautiful October morning through this gorgeous park, and finally ran her car off the road right near where we are here, right around, I believe, over there. It's pretty different then. So once they got run off the road, her daughter tried to get out of the car first. Imogene went and said, "No, stay in the car," and pulled her door shut. Imogene then got out of the car and turned towards George, who was coming towards her. And she's like, Daddy, no, I'm sorry. She called her Daddy. And started running away because he was mad. He finally caught up to her as she was trying to run up a little embankment and pulled her close and took a pistol and shot her right here in the breast. And she fell. She was dead. She wasn't dead yet. She got rushed to Deaconess Hospital where she died on the operating table about an hour later. George got in his car. He was elated. He was like, that was the best thing that happened to me for years, you know? He was so excited. Well, he knew he had to turn himself in. So he went and turned himself in and didn't regret a thing. And then it went to trial. Instead of getting an attorney, he actually, since he was an attorney, he actually, was an attorney for himself. And you could just imagine what it was like. The other lawyer was Charles Taft II, and he was just a regular guy, a prosecutor, and George put on such a spectacle. And keep in mind too, this is the 1920s in Cincinnati. The majority of people here are German, they're probably the children of German immigrants, if they weren't German immigrants themselves. And that was what George was too. So they kind of had this sympathetic thing. He also greased so many hands in this city that I'm sure that there were a few that he had really helped out in the city, before he had gotten caught. So the trial went on. It was crazy. It was in all the newspapers. It must have been such a spectacle to wake up every morning and read about what was going on in this case. And eventually, the jury went out and they came back and they found him not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. So he got off. He had to spend like 2 months in a Longview hospital. And then he got married again to a woman named Blanche Wilson, and he lived the rest of his days in Covington, trying to get back his stuff that Imogene and Dodge sold off.
So did he ever build his empire back or get money?
No, he went into real estate. I think he probably was a part. All of his cronies, all of the people who worked for George, had gotten into different things, mostly in Newport, Kentucky, which was kind of the Sin City of the time. And I'm sure he had some dealings with them, but he never got back into bootlegging, as far as we know.
How did he die?
So he died of a heart attack. I think it was July 20th. I think it was January 20th. It was 1952. And he passed away. He passed away of a heart attack. He had a stroke, and then he was kind of like being taken care of by nurses in a boarding house, and then he died.
And so, really, he had just a mighty fall after all this. And do you know if he had any run-ins with the mob? Did they like him? Did they dislike him, or did they just leave him alone?
I think they probably left him alone, but he had greased so many hands that I'm sure he was still well liked, but they had probably got into a business themselves that they didn't feel that they needed him. I don't know. I don't know much after the whole trial. So.
Well, thank you for doing that today, and thanks for telling us about George Remus and why this gazebo is so important.
Yeah, they still today, they say that there's a lady in blue who haunts here. And if you see a lady in a blue dress, that's most likely Imogene. So just tell her hi.
Didn't you say there are a couple books that are great to read?
Yeah, there are 2 incredible books on George Remus that you must check out. They're both also on Audible, so you can listen to them. One is called King of the Bootleggers. It's by a good friend of mine named Bob Batchelor. Fantastic book. You must read it. The other one, also one of my favorite. It's a little bit more romanticized, but so good. It's called The Ghost of Eden Park. And it's by Karen Abbott. And she is an amazing author, great person. You will love both of those books. So highly recommend reading them.
Well, thank you, Molly.
Sure, thank you.
Well, that was great. And Molly, thanks for telling everybody about George Remus. I know I wanted to do this vlog a long time ago, and I knew I had a lot of research to do. And when I met Molly at 1940s Day, I thought, well, why try to attempt to talk about when I have an expert here? So thank you, Molly, for doing that. And Molly has written a book that you definitely should get. And it talks about history, it talks about mixology, and it's just a great read. It's called Handcrafted Cocktails. And you should definitely get yours now. So thank you, Molly, for your help.
Thank you for having me. This is so cool.
Yes, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Be sure to like, subscribe. It's free to subscribe, And be sure to share on your social media. So until next time, this is Cashew with Molly Wellman signing off. And not far from the gazebo is the Cincinnati Art Museum. And that green dome that you see, that's where the artists Duveneck and Barnhorn shared a studio.